Welcome to HHMI's 2015 Holiday Lectures on Science. This year's lectures, Patterns and Processes in Ecology, will be given by two leaders in ecological research, Dr. Robert Pringle and Dr. Corina Tarnita of Princeton University. The third lecture is titled, How Species Coexist. And now, Dr. Robert Pringle.
Hi again. So, all right, now I'm going to confront you guys with the classic problem of community ecology. And this is an enduring problem. We love it because it never gets fully answered, which means we can keep working on it. And generations of students and faculty and folks have been studying this problem for a long time. So the question is, how can ecologically similar species share the same habitat? These are all large mammalian herbivore species, and they are all living in our representative savanna ecosystem, Gorongosa National Park. So I'm going to leave that question there and tell you, why is that a paradox? Why should that be a problem? Why shouldn't there be all those species coexisting in the same place? Well, to understand that, you really got to understand the competition coexistence paradox, right? And so that's if you have two species that are competing for food. Here we have buffalo on the left and waterbuck on the right, and they're competing for a single food, which is buffalo grass, Panicum maximum. And buffalo grass is especially efficiently consumed and especially preferred by buffalo. And that makes them the dominant competitor in this situation, okay? And over time, what that can lead to is competitive exclusion, right? The competitively subordinate species, waterbuck in this case, will actually go extinct. Competitive exclusion is a classic phenomenon originally demonstrated in with paramecia in laboratory environments, but also potentially a risk in the real world. Now, if you want biodiversity, and I for one want biodiversity, then you need coexistence mechanisms. You need mechanisms that enable ecologically similar species to coexist in the same habitat. And there are a couple classes of coexistence mechanisms, and we don't have time to talk about but one of them. But a big one that we're not going to talk about is predation, and especially the phenomenon of keystone predation. As you guys may have heard of keystone species, that term of keystone derives from this idea that, in this case, the starfish will disproportionately prey on the dominant competitors, which are constantly becoming more abundant because they're dominant competitors, and it'll therefore create room for subordinate mussel or barnacle species to coexist. Okay? But what we're going to be more focused on, exclusively focused on today, is what we call bottom-up mechanisms. And that involves competition between ecologically similar species and how that leads to what we call niche partitioning, so differentiation in resource use. Okay? Now, there's a couple of different ways you can think about niche partitioning. You can think about it in space. So here are 6 different antelope species that are coexisting in a sort of grassy open woodland savanna with a little swamp in it. And they're occupying particular niches in this habitat. So the reedbuck in the reeds over there, the nyala in the deep woods. And this is a common form of niche partitioning. It's associated with the ecologist Joseph Grinnell. And another classic example you guys might have come across is anolis lizards, which partition the vertical tree canopy. So ungulates, or large hoofed mammals, can do that too. Dietary niche partitioning is another key mechanism that we need to consider. And the way this has been thought about in the case of these big, large mammals here is largely in terms of something called the grazer-browser spectrum. So over here on the left we have zebra. That's a grazer. Means it eats predominantly grass. And over there on the right we have a dik-dik, and it eats almost exclusively non-grass or browse. And for those of you guys who don't know what a dik-dik looks like, it's a 5-kilogram antelope. We happen to have a replica skull here. So that's dik-dik, and it's got, if we were to look at the cranial morphology and the teeth of that replica, we'd be able to see adaptations to a browsing lifestyle, or rather, we'd be able to see the absence of adaptations to a grazing lifestyle. And then in the middle, we have what we call mixed feeders. So this impala might eat a 50-50 mix of both grasses and browse. Okay, so that's the grazer-browser spectrum. Another form of dietary niche partitioning is that animals can separate out by height. All right, so this one should make intuitive sense. If you've got 3 large browsers, again, browsers being the ones that eat trees and don't eat grasses. So here we have giraffe, kudu, and steinbuck, and feeding along a height axis on a tree. And the proportion of time that they spend feeding is there on the x-axis, and you see the giraffe spends most of its time feeding on the tall parts of the tree, the kudu at the intermediate parts, and the steinbuck at the lowest parts. Believe it or not, something similar is true for how grazers partition their grass. So if we have, again, our one grass species, this is our Panicum maximum buffalo grass. This is the examples from the Serengeti, where they have a long dry season. And when the rains come, the grass grows tall. And the first herbivores to move in to start foraging on that tall grass are zebra, which they're non-ruminant and large body-sized animals, which means they have to eat a lot of food and they don't digest it very thoroughly. So that's kind of their strategy. So they move in and they eat this grass, which is relatively low quality, has a lot of stems. They're followed by wildebeests, who prefer grass of a slightly intermediate height and slightly higher quality, because as the grass gets shorter, then we're getting to the more nutritious parts of it. And lastly, the smallest and most selective herbivore species, Thompson's gazelle, is feeding at the smallest, the shortest grass that you find sort of 6 months after the rain, after the other herbivores have passed through. And this is a phenomenon known as grazing succession, and it also relates to a concept known as facilitation, because zebra are thought to be sort of preparing, if you will, the range or the pasture for wildebeest, and wildebeest further prepare it for Thompson's gazelle. So they're actually a positive as opposed to a competitive interaction among these species in this situation. So that's the classical view, right? That's what we have from classic studies from the 60s up to today, really. But my colleagues and I at Princeton, and particularly my colleague Tyler Kartzenell, got really interested in another form of niche partitioning that has received virtually no attention. And that is whether herbivores partition different plant species. So the interesting thing about the 2 different kinds of niche partitioning that I showed you guys up till now is that it really only requires 2 different kinds of plants, if you think about it, minimally, right? It requires grass and it requires tree. And you can eat the tall part of the tree, you can eat the short part of the tree. You can eat the grass or you can eat the tree. And it's pretty simple, and we actually know that savanna ecosystems are much more complex. The one that I work in Kenya has more than 600 plant species. The one I work in Gorongosa in Mozambique has more than 1,000, well more than 1,000. So there's a lot of plant species diversity that could be partitioned, and we don't know anything about how these animals do that, kind of surprisingly. You'd think we'd know everything about a zebra by now. So how might you try to go about finding out which species eat what? Well, this, again, until very recently, this is how you do it. You grab binoculars, and you go out, and you try to get looks at animals eating. And you guys are immediately cueing in on the point, which is that it is really, really hard to figure out. You know, even in this was close. This thing was in my backyard, and I took a photo of it with a 400 millimeter lens. So, you know, I'm right up in its face, and I still can't tell. It's not eating grass. It's in the middle of grass, but there's a little forb called Pollichia that makes red berries, and that's what's in there, and that's what the animal's actually eating. So, you know, what you see. Don't believe what you see. And so this is really problematic, right? And of course, many herbivores are active in dusk, at night, and then this is what you'd see if you went out and tried to do the same thing, right? And that's even less informative about what plant species